Before we start, if you usually express your appreciation and your enthusiasm by doing this, then tonight we need to translate that into Auslan. Yeah, you know what's going on. Tonight it will be this. So please make welcome your unheard of panellists. Amy, will you introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, my name is Amy Blake, and this is my sign name. I have my scarf, I often wear scarves, so my sign name is sort of like scarf. I'm the only deaf person in my family, and I have 2 hearing children.
And Diana?
Diana. My name is Diana Hodgetts, and I'm deaf myself, and there are 7 deaf people in my family. Over to you, Jeanette.
Hi everyone. My name's Jeanette Symonds. I'm deaf and I also have 2 cochlear implants. I grew up using spoken English and started signing when I was around 12 years old. My name is Stephen Nicholson. I grew up using Auslan as my first language, and I'm from a 3rd generation deaf family.
And just to help everybody relax and settle in tonight, Amy, would you mind telling us a joke?
Oh, happy to share some of our deaf jokes. There's a couple. They're just recently married. They're on a honeymoon. Oh, just need to point out they're both deaf, of course, in the throes of love. And off they are one night on their honeymoon, and the wife decides she's going to go back to the hotel room and just relax for a while, have some quiet time. And the husband's thinking, I'll stay in the bar, keep having a few drinks, and then became mindful of the time and thought, oh, you know what? I can't remember which room we had. What do I know. Got out of the pub, got into his car, honked on the horn, and then looked at all the windows of the hotel room, saw all the lights going on, and one didn't go on. Ah, that's my room. Perfect. Off he went.
Diana?
My joke. I was a man, and he was a tree fella. He worked at chopping down trees, And one day he come to a tree and he'd done his chopping and he called out, "Timber!" Tree fell down. He got to another tree, did his cutting, yelled out, "Timber!" Tree fell down. Then he got to another tree and he's yelling out, "Timber!" Nothing happened. He's like, what do I do? Oh, it's just not working here. He thought he'd get the tree doctor in. Got the tree doctor in, they came in, got out his stethoscope, had a little look at the tree, did a couple of knocks to see what was happening. How's it working? Why is it not working? And he said, he then finger spelt to the tree, Timber, and down it went.
Great. And thank you for sharing your jokes and some of the richness of deaf culture with us tonight. Can I start, for people who don't know, Amy, are Auslan and English the same language? Definitely
not. Completely different languages. Auslan has its own grammatical structure, just as English has its own grammatical structure. So, to give you an example, in English, if you were to say, I am going to the shops in that very linear format with individual words. In Auslan, if you were to try to translate that literally, you might sign shop, me go, or I go shop, now me shop. It would be very different and present very differently.
Diana, what do you think?
Oh, they're very different, completely different. I was brought up, you see, using what we call the oral method, so lip reading. And I really was exposed only to English, written English really, and spoken English. But some of the English words, they just didn't make sense to me. There were 2 or 3 different meanings for one individual English word. You know how English works, and it gets really confusing. So, I'd look at books, and as I was reading the book, I'd just think, read a sentence, and I'd skip a word that I didn't understand. That was how I managed.
Jeanette, do you think of yourself as bilingual?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm bilingual. I'm living in the hearing world, obviously, with hearing people using English and other spoken languages, and I'm also part of the deaf community, yeah.
What about you, Stephen? How do you see the difference between the two languages?
Yeah, they're absolutely different languages. They have their own linguistic structures. They have very different grammatical rules between the two languages. So in Auslan, it might work differently to English, and some spoken languages have more similar structures to Auslan. So Spanish, for instance, might, the word order might be closer to Auslan. And we also use a lot of visual, gestural features in Auslan. It's very visual language, so quite different from a spoken English.
In your internal monologue, when you talk to yourself in your mind, given you have these two very different languages you use, do you talk to yourself in sign, Amy?
Again, it really depends on the context, actually. I think if I'm reading a book and I'm really directly interacting with written English, I will create a visual picture in my mind, and the visual picture of the concepts related to signs, I then can translate from there back into the English. If I'm reading screeds, and screeds are quite complex information, a lot of paperwork, or, something that's very academic, I can translate back into Auslan, but, sometimes you just have to operate in English, and being bilingual, you do, sometimes you just are in the one language. You can move between the two of them, but sometimes you just stay in that one language. It depends on what you're reading. And from Amy, if someone, for example, was to ask me a question in English, I might actually, get it interpreted to me, and the translation is done by the interpreter in that respect. But if there's then time there might be time needed to process that answer, so that the interpreter might take a little bit of time in order to watch my answer delivered in Auslan and then translate that back from Auslan into English. And that takes a little bit of unpacking sometimes, or a little bit of time just to move between the two. It is a long process. And from Diana, in terms of hearing jokes, what we call hearing jokes, like for a lot of deaf people, jokes that are presented in English, are quite a mystery to us. So if we look at, we might get a joke and hearing the mainstream community will laugh about it. And then they'll say to us, we'll say as a deaf person, what did that joke mean? I missed it. And the response we might get from the people we're talking to might be, look, I'll tell you later. That is a point of endless frustration.
No. Rude. And does some good deaf jokes not work when you try and translate them into English too? Yeah. Jeanette, when you talk to yourself in your mind, what language do you use?
Let me think.
I do both, from Diana.
I guess I would see things in pictures more than in English words. I'm much more visual, so if I'm reading English, yes, maybe I'm thinking a little more in English. But if it's something I'm feeling or contemplating, I guess I'd say it's more visual for me. Yeah, I'm definitely more visual than in English.
And from Amy, it's a lot more visual. I think we see things visually. We interpret the world visually.
What about for you?
Well, I have travelled a lot around the world, and I've been overseas, and there are many different languages I can use. So, and I know that some people can dream in Spanish, and I'm also familiar with American Sign Language and New Zealand Sign Language. So I'm exposed to a lot of different sign languages, and it depends where I am and what I'm doing. So, I guess there are people out there who can speak a lot of different spoken languages. I've got 8 different sign languages that I can use, and it just depends on the situation I'm in as to what I'm thinking or what language I'm using.
Wow. Have you studied to learn sign languages of so many different places?
Well, I have lived overseas and travelled quite extensively. I've been through America, Canada and England, and also Portugal. And my work involved travelling around South America, so I've just met a lot of people and absorbed language that way. I didn't have formal education of those languages, it's just by working and interacting with people in those places. So I've just been able to learn them and also access written English and written Spanish as well in my time.
So you're not bilingual, you are multilingual. Yeah.
Correct. Yep.
Impressive. Amy, when you talk about experiencing the world very visually, why should I never be offended if a deaf person tells me I've put on weight?
I guess culturally we notice things, it's part of the way that we do things, I guess. Like, if deaf people haven't seen each other for a very, very long time, and we often haven't because we're immersed in the hearing world, and we haven't seen someone for quite some time, we might say, we notice that they might have put on weight. And we might appear to speak to mainstream community norms a bit more directly. But I think that, if we're in the hearing world, so to speak, we would never speak like that. Like, it wouldn't, we'd say, oh, you look really well. We might say something a little bit more gently to them, or, looking really well. But, for myself, moving between the two worlds, I have to shift between the two cultural norms, and I have to regulate myself and respond appropriately to each cultural group. So there's a lot of work going on there. So I think that when, my mother is hearing, so she, she's, for example, the day she dyed her eyebrows, oh my Lord, she walked in the door and all I could see were the eyebrows. And I went, Mum, your eyebrows. And she was, I said, and she looked at me like, oh my God, they look really, really bad, don't they? And my daughter was like, Grandma, what have you done? And then I was immediately going, oh no, it'll fade. It's just because it's the initial dye, so we have to go through that.
What is the long goodbye, Diana?
Well, the deaf long goodbye, I guess you could say. When the deaf clubs closed, where we all used to get together and meet, the doors would shut of whatever venue we were at. Oh my goodness, we hadn't seen each other all week or all month or how long it had been. And we'd be like, oh, I forgot to tell you this, but just before you go, I've got to tell you, there's something else I needed to mention or ask. That's the reason. There's a reason that we have the long goodbye.
Jeanette, what is something you treasure about deaf culture?
It's quiet. I have no noise. And if I'm not wearing my cochlear implants, I'm not accessing noise. So sometimes it's noisy using implants and it can give me headaches when I take them off at the end of the day, or when I take them off and just communicate in Auslan. It feels comfortable, it's quiet, it's soothing. I could sleep like a baby and without interruptions of noises in the night. So, and I feel sorry for hearing people, they have to put up with noise and, conversations and all that sort of stuff, whereas deaf people can sleep very peacefully.
Jeanette, on that line, how tiring can it be to be stepping into that hearing world all the time when you prefer the quiet?
Oh, it is a lot.
Some hearing people speak very fast, or they might turn their head when they're talking to you, or you may have a whole group of people in a room and it's really hard to follow what's being said because the communication is so fast, the speech is so fast. So, it can be really tiring.
Stephen, how did you find your place in the deaf community? Well,
I consider myself culturally deaf. My parents are deaf, and my grandparents are deaf as well. So I would always attend deaf social events. I always met, deaf seniors. They had amazing stories and I had access to them my whole life. So some people went to boarding schools, some didn't. There was a lot of changes in the community I've noticed through my lifetime in terms of how people gathered. I went to a hearing school, but a lot of people went to a deaf school. And when I went overseas for a year on an exchange, I went to a deaf school. There were 1,000 kids at that school. And my parents also told me about their experiences in school. So I always had a place in the deaf community. And that through my travels, I've realised deaf people are the same everywhere. We don't have to explain what it's like to be deaf to each other. We just instantly connect. And of course, there's variation in the deaf community. Some people sign, some people grow up speaking and join the deaf community later. But regardless of if they've grown up signing or speaking, they're always welcomed into the deaf community. And travelling the world, I see a lot of similar stories across all those deaf communities.
How different was your experience, Amy?
That's really interesting when I reflect about being younger. I went to a mainstream school, but they had a deaf program at the school. We had access to sign language interpreters. We had access to teachers of the deaf and people who used sign language. So I felt that, however, given that my identity it wavered. I didn't feel 100% part of the deaf community, being the only person in my family who was deaf. Everyone around me was hearing, So I felt a little bit left out on the home front, always. And yet my identity wavered a bit. And perhaps when I left school and I became a lot more involved in the deaf community and I felt that shared experience, that lived experience of having lived as a deaf person, and then I could relate to a lot more people who had the same experience.
I can add to that from Stephen as well. So I grew up in a deaf family, so it meant I just thought, everyone's signing, we're all the same in my family. And for me, it was like, yay, school holidays are coming, and it was always exciting. But in my class, lots of kids hated school holidays because they would be bored at home. They didn't have communication with their family members. So, it wasn't the same experience for them. And people always loved coming to my house to socialise. We would always invite people because it felt like their home, their second home in my house, because we all signed and they had access to the communication. And I saw someone who I hadn't seen for years, and they were telling me, I absolutely loved visiting your home. I felt, really comfortable there, and it was really, it gave me confidence that I had that experience with your family.
Diana, have you kind of had both of those experiences in one generation of your family and then the next?
My mother was hearing. My father wasn't in the picture. So it was just the two of us. So we would just sit at the table and eat and read books. There was no TV, of course, in my day. So when I was probably about 18 or so, there was captioning only on the Sunday for the news, only once in a week. And now there's captioning, hooray, everywhere, thank goodness. But, where there were no captions on the TV, I just wouldn't watch it. It's a waste of my time. No access, there's no point. So that was then. And I think now, thanks to the most amazing technology we have now, I was just trying to remember that when I had my first baby, and I'd pop them in the cot next to me, we had a baby cry alarm. I was so excited to have that. So when the baby cried, a light would flash on and off, and that would alert me to when the baby required me. But, it didn't work 100% of the time. Sometimes a truck would go past, or a heavy vehicle would go past, or a motorbike would go past, and I'd check the baby, and then sound asleep. And I'd get up for nothing. And sometimes when the baby would just roll around and move in the bed, it would trigger the flashing light. Oh, gee, the lost sleep. But, after, technology these days has given us so much, and made life so much easier compared to the older times. But, one day, it was a really, really hot day. And, being deaf, there were no such things as flashing lights for fire alarms or any such thing. And I had this knock at the door. These two ladies had come in and they ripped the fire alarm out. That was like a very expensive item that I'd had put into my home. I didn't know it was going. I said, I am deaf. I can't hear. And the two women were like, oh, very sorry about that. Oh dear, that was a moment. And there are more occasions too. Like when I think of like, you know, there was a blue Russian cat that we had. And it was close to Christmas time, quite close to Christmas time. And my husband had, you know, popped up a ladder to get access to the roost, you know, for the Christmas tree and get all the decorations down, get ready for Christmas. And anyway, he closed it all up and then we were looking around for our cat, looking and looking, you know. And we were thinking, oh, he's such a good puss. But for 2 days we couldn't find him, calling and calling and calling. And then a hearing person came in and said, I can hear a cat meowing somewhere. And we went, oh, it's been in the roof all this time. Oh, the poor cat, it was like, you know, skinny as a rake. Its eyes were hanging out of its poor little head. But, you know, so things like that did happen.
Jeanette, the technology as your life goes on, how much of a difference is it making for you?
It definitely has. I remember growing up seeing people using telephones, and as a deaf person I could never use a phone. So if I wanted to contact a friend, I couldn't. And once I got to be a teenager, we got a TTY, which was a particular machine for deaf people to type into, and we could communicate back and forth on our TTYs. So I was able to use my TTY with my friends, which was great. And then we got mobile phones, which had SMS, which of course was fantastic. A new way to communicate for people who can't hear on the phone. And then the NRS, the National Relay Service. If I wanted to ring and order a pizza or something, and I didn't want to ask my parents to call on my behalf, if I wanted to be more independent and just do things by myself, or if I wanted to privately call my boyfriend and not rely on someone else to make that call, I could do it through this National Relay Service. They call it the NRS. So that would go through an operator. So I would type, the operator would call the phone number and then relay that message to them and back and forth. And look, things have changed again. Then we had Skype and we had, you know, video conferencing. We can now have interpreters and sign conversations through lots of new technologies now, and it's made a huge impact on the deaf community. We can be so much more independent now. We can contact people all over the world as well, and we can do it ourselves.
You know, just in relation to that, just talking about the use of phones, there was a neighbour that I had who had 9 children, right? And every day I would go across with and say, could I just get you to could you use your phone and please make a doctor's appointment, please? And then I'd go, and then the children would read the whole message that I'd written down to my neighbour. Oh, they knew everything about our family.
Pretty wonderful changes in your lifetime.
Oh, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Stephen, being from a multi-generational deaf family, how highly esteemed is that in your community?
Well, there's pros and cons actually of being in a deaf family in the deaf community. So if you come from a hearing family, they do not know what you're up to. They don't have any idea what you're doing. But I'm in a deaf family and they would know what's going on, or my rellies knew what was happening. All the people in the deaf community knew what was happening. So I didn't kind of have the private life that some of these other people had. And I would get caught out doing this or that. And yeah, anything that happened, people would know. So there's disadvantages as well. Having a signing family is definitely great. My grandparents always said, yes, you're from a deaf family, but you are not better than anyone else in the deaf community. Everyone's as important as each other. We're all equal. You have the good luck of being in a deaf family and having Auslan and shared communication in your family environment, and not everyone has that. But yeah, we were taught to believe that everyone's equal in the community, and we share Auslan as our language. And, you know, deaf people have different groups, you know, same as the hearing community. There are all sorts of variations, different levels of status within every community, and that exists in the deaf community and the hearing community. But, yeah, I was always taught to believe everyone's equal.
Are there times where it comes in really handy that you can have a conversation through glass or across a really long distance. You know?
Absolutely, from Diana. Yes, from Amy. If you wouldn't mind me responding to that. Once I was driving along in the car and I was just waving frantically because I knew that person. And so we just signed to each other. I was using my rear vision mirror and they were just signing to me through their window. So, you know, and there are some deaf people that actually, quite often, we will actually sign to each other whilst driving and drive with our knees. I'm an angel. I am perfect. I won't do that. But there are those who do. You know, I'll only sign when I've parked.
Are there any police officers in the building tonight?
Don't spread it anybody, please.
Yeah.
In relation to Amy's response, you know, like when you can sign to another person who's sitting next to you, obviously, but oh my goodness, the motorbike, you know, if they come up and you're thinking, oh, better let them come in first. But when you see that movement and you're signing in your car to somebody, someone will come up beside you in a car, on a motorbike, for example, and say, no, don't you wave your hands, don't you do that while you're driving. You've got to concentrate on the road. So that's the sort of downside of being able to chat with each other.
Stephen talked about being a deaf child of deaf parents, that he couldn't get away with things. As a deaf parent of hearing children, how do you make sure they're not getting away with things? Amy?
Could you just repeat that question again?
Another question?
The same question.
I'll repeat the question.
Yep.
Sorry. Stephen was saying, as a deaf child of deaf parents, that he couldn't get away with anything. When you're a deaf parent of hearing children, how are you making sure they're not getting away with anything?
Well, I think I'm looking for things in terms of their body language usually lets me know. As soon as I open the door and I see them quickly moving or quickly, I think, no, you tell me, what are you doing? I can see just from their reaction to my presence. Or if I've just opened the door and I see them, or if they're stealing a lolly or something like that, I'm like, no, bedtime, no lollies now. You know the rules, you know the time of day. Oh, I have to hand it across. I think there's that. So the reading of body language. But if I'm in another room, you know, and so if I've got a hearing person in the house or someone who can hear in the house and they might hear something that's happened and they might hear language that one of my children has used and that my children are in another room, I think it's appropriate that people do let me know that, because then I follow up, you know, because that's something I'm not privy to. And now look, a little bird told me that you were using some inappropriate language there. No, I wasn't. Now, you're off text for a week. Do you understand that? You're not going to be able to use your SMS. Done deal. You know? Consequences really need to be given, I think.
Yeah. And Jeanette, the closed captions came on the TV, and that's one thing. But now, more and more, important information is also delivered in Auslan. What does it mean to you to be able to access vital services in your first language?
It's really important, absolutely. In terms of emergency broadcasts and that sort of thing, some of the words they use on the captions are new and they're unfamiliar. So they're talking about coronavirus, for instance. There's a lot of new words that are associated with that we're not necessarily familiar with. So having an interpreter there and seeing it in Auslan means we have greater access to that information, and we can talk amongst ourselves about, you know, what that information is, and we can share that information in our community. So it's absolutely vital, yeah.
Did everyone walk in and go, oh, he's COVID famous? Totally.
I just want to add to that from Stephen. In terms of having information in Auslan, there's an old couple up in New South Wales, and they were watching TV when there was some sort of emergency in Queensland, and they had some sort of cyclone or something. They had two hearing children who lived in Queensland. They saw this information and they immediately texted their children about what was happening. And the children were like, how do you even know this is happening in our state? And they said, well, we saw the interpreter on TV. And so it's absolutely important that people get information in their first language. And they're not just relying on seeing captions, which are obviously in English. So, and, you know, it's not always something that can happen in emergency situations. Of course, at the moment, you know, the government use interpreters for emergency broadcasts and that sort of thing, but you can also use interpreters when it's good news, and we would encourage the government to do more of that.
Yeah. Have you become a specialist in all kinds of fields in your interpreting career?
Yeah. So, working as a deaf interpreter, I work alongside hearing interpreters, and I'm able to also interpret for people who may use different styles of Auslan. They may have grown up overseas and learnt Auslan late, so you have to have a huge skill set to work with a variety of people who are in the deaf community, and deaf interpreters are incredibly skilled at that, and it's a way of empowering a lot of different deaf people in the community by using a deaf interpreter.
And you learn legal language and medical language and, you know, emergency services, jargon. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And the interpreting community across different states really work together well. We have WhatsApp groups, we get together on Zoom and things like that, and yeah, we share information amongst ourselves. I was recently in WA at an interpreting course for media interpreters over there, so trying to develop their skills and their language base over there. So make sure interpreters are using consistent language as well when they're doing that type of work. And in Tasmania, we're obviously targeting the Tasmanian deaf community. When we're interpreting, we want to make sure our interpretation matches the needs of the community, and different states are doing the same thing. So there are particular signs that are relevant for the communities. So, you know, interpreters that work in that space need to know what's, you know, unique to that space, and make sure their interpretation targets that community so the information gets across. And it's not, you don't just grab any interpreter off the street to do that work. It involves training. And look, you know, I have actually done that sort of work my whole life. In a school situation, if another student didn't understand something that I understood, I would then interpret that for them and do that sort of work. So I think, you know, I've been doing it for a really long time, and translating also for people in the classroom, like other hearing interpreters might sometimes need assistance in the classroom, and I've done that too. So, yeah. Some deaf interpreters are from deaf families, other people are just passionate about Auslan. There are lots of different reasons people become interpreters, and once they get that job, it's really important that they get across all the skills required.
Amy, Stephen talked about you can sign good news as well. When did you take an interpreter to Christmas? What happened?
Oh, yes, that's right. You know, fortunately, we now are able to access National Disability Insurance Scheme funding from the NDIS. And I think, you know, at significant family events, particularly Christmas, you know, I'd go along, but everyone was talking. I felt really left out. I really wasn't part of the communication and the conversation between people. I thought, why don't I use my NDS funding? I think what I'll do is I'll book an interpreter. And you know what? I booked an interpreter and I felt included. I felt part of my family, able to ask questions. I didn't have to work hard. I could be involved in the humour and the conversation, in whatever conversation went on. And, you know, I didn't... As soon as the interpreter left, though, I felt disconnected again. You know, I wasn't as included. I wasn't part of dialogues anymore. It was pretty stark. And, you know, that I did that 2 years ago, and it was really quite poignant.
Jeanette, has the NDIS made a difference for you in where you can access translation services?
Definitely. Yep. I'm able to access interpreting for anything I need Like if I want to go to the Telstra shop or something and I need to get some more information about buying a new phone, or if I want to get an iPad and talk to someone about all the different plans you can do, then I can get an interpreter to come and I get access to that information, which is fantastic. And also maybe you're going to a car yard or something and you're looking at cars, or, you know, you want to ask about the motor, or, you know, if you want to ask detailed questions, it's really helpful to have an interpreter there, and it's fantastic that we have NDIS funding to provide some of that interpreting.
If I could just add something to that, you know, the NDIS, of course, is brilliant. You know, it's great for hard of hearing or deaf people, signing deaf people, or people who use oral, who use speech and audition to communicate. But unfortunately, it's not available to people over the age of 65. A lot of people in our community have been signing deaf since birth, since they were tiny, and they have had access to so many things in our community, and they are being denied access to significant services and opportunities in the community. So I think we do have access to medical interpreting through NABS, you know, like that's the medical interpreting service for going to the doctor and whatnot. But if we were to go to a social event, or like I was talking about, you know, they won't get access to that. They won't be able to access NDIS funding for that. But people who are under the age of 65 do get access to interpreters and technologies that can support us. And they also get access to being able to Auslan in the home, to educate other family members about how to use Auslan and how to, you know, use interpreting service or translation services with complex text and get that translated into Auslan. We can use our NDIS funds for that, but people over the age of 65 are denied that access.
Has a reason ever been given for that?
No, from Diana.
From Stephen. My mum has missed it by a week. So she was just the wrong week, and she got a no when she applied for the NDIS. So, yeah, it's all about the government. It's their decision. And I do work in the community services area. Obviously, NDIS is rolled out across all of Australia, but we have quite low levels of funding in Tasmania if you compare that to other states. So that's really quite disappointing and frustrating. You know, the government decides on that, and you know, it's always quite a fight to get funding for the deaf community. And when, you know, people apply, and you know, people who are making those decisions don't have a lived experience of, you know, being a deaf person in this community, and it becomes a real barrier. So, you know, yeah, it's great to have NDIS. Does this provide equal access to every deaf person in our community? Absolutely not.
It doesn't, and I fully agree with Stephen. You know, we live every day we live as a deaf person, and every day I experience barriers in my world, just as everyone else do. And the other deaf people here would also experience barriers as well, I'm sure. You know, we have that shared experience.
It's the definition of bureaucracy, isn't it? Going, oh, we'll put the age limit there. Oh, a week out, sorry, you missed it. Just those arbitrary decisions that can be made with no understanding that are affecting people's lives.
Definitely.
We have a bit of time to take questions as well. So whether you're hearing or deaf, if you'd like to raise your hand to ask a question, and then someone will come to you with a microphone, or you can stand and sign your question, and then Stephen can interpret that. Would anyone like to ask a question? Go on, be brave. Over here.
Could we just ask the person asking the question to stand up, please, so we can see you? Thank you.
Hi. I'm just wondering if anyone here knows what the percentage of Tasmanians who speak, who Auslan is their first language.
From Jeanette, there was a recent census, wasn't there? So was it 2016 the last census? census? No, we did one more recent than that from Stephen. I think under 300 is the correct number of people who use Auslan in Tasmania. From Stephen, I don't think that's actually a correct number. I've been here for around 6.5 years. I would estimate it's more like 500 signing deaf and 5,000 people who are hard of hearing. And that, of course, covers all of Tasmania, not just Hobart. The census is improving how they collect data, but it's not. It doesn't always correctly record how many Auslan users there are.
Who was telling the story about filling out the census? Amy, was that you? That some people tick English because they go, oh, well, there's the list. So deaf Auslan speakers might be underrepresented?
I think on the census it had other, but the last sentence they actually put on Auslan, so you could actually tick that. But on the internet you had to type it in. So I think if you did it electronically, like I put it on because, for my children, it's their first language. That's the language that they grew up with. So yeah, we had to write it on particularly.
And it wasn't easy to find Auslan if you wanted to select it. And I think for other spoken languages as well, for instance, if you speak Spanish or whatever, it was not easy to find where to click on that answer. So I think that affected how many people were recorded as Auslan users.
Yeah, right. Thank you for the question. Does anyone else have one? One over here.
I have a question for Stephen. My first language is English. I've been learning Spanish for a long time. I'm still very much a student. Can you give me an example of a different Auslan word and a different Spanish sign language word? Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. I've got the perfect example. So in Auslan, we use the sign water, which I'm doing right now on my cheek, okay? And in agua is the word in Spanish, and this is where it's situated. It's on the chin, okay? So very close to the Auslan sign. And that actually means beach in Auslan. So they're all, beer, I beg your pardon. So they're all quite connected. Blue, the colour blue, on the back of the hand, in Spanish is azul, and they use this sign, which is sign near the eyes, which relates to blue eyes. So there are some incredible connections there.
Nice. Thank you for the question. Any more? Down the back here.
Could I just ask that people please stand up? Thank you, just so we can see you.
So obviously we're at TMAG, which is a beautiful cultural institution in Tasmania. What are technologies or things that you would like to see more places like this, or maybe like zoos with guided tours, using or having that make what they do more accessible for you?
From Jeanette, definitely providing interpreters. That's the best thing for me, having interpreter access.
And always asking the person who comes in, ask them, say, what's your preferred mode of communication? Ask the question outright. If there's an event that's coming up, I think it's actually really culturally sensitive and appropriate to sort of meet with particular members of community and ask them about what they feel would be appropriate. Meet with hard of hearing people, meet with signing deaf people, captions ideally.
I've also noticed in terms of museums, they often have information beside an artwork in English, and you can also provide that information in Auslan. So people often have little headsets. They might wander around the museum listening to a program or lectures or information about the artworks in an audio form. but there's sign language equivalents. You can have an iPad or something like that. You can get that information on a video in Auslan. So it's basically, in England, they've got one that shows 5 separate sign languages. So there's international sign, there's British sign, there's French Sign Language and German Sign Language, and also Spanish Sign Language, because so many people from all over the world come to that museum. They are providing all of those different sign language translations for their information. So that's, world leading, and we could do that sort of thing. Those resources are out there. You would just need to get in touch with the deaf community and say, okay, at my particular place, we'd like to improve access. What do we do? And they could guide you. Sometimes it's about funding, but don't assume just always get in touch with the deaf community.
And if I could agree very much with that. I think that, and I don't mean to be offensive in any way, but often people will say, I'll do that. I've got an idea about that. And they haven't actually checked with the community. They haven't actually discussed how things could be prevented in a culturally appropriate manner and perhaps approach the Deaf Society.
I'll give you an example. At the hospital emergency department, K Block, our new lovely, whiz-bang building that we've got, I couldn't get through the door because there's a button where you have to speak on a speaker. As a deaf person, you can't get through. So technology is wonderful. It's a brand new building and they haven't thought about people with different needs. So I had to bang on the door and they're like, why didn't you press the buzzer? It's like, I'm deaf. And then they let me through. So things like that. Yes, there's all this technology in the world. It's fabulous, but sometimes people don't join the dots or they just don't know about access for deaf people. And it makes us more disabled if things are designed in that way.
Probably time for one more question. I think yours was first up then. Yeah. Can you stand up? Thank you.
We've moved to Tassie a couple of years ago from WA, where we had friends in the deaf community. He's deaf. And when we moved to Tassie, we found it really hard to meet people and families. We've met one other family in Deloraine now through the education department. But his question was, what is a good way to meet deaf people in Tasmania? We live on the East Coast.
Great question.
Who'd like to answer that? Stephen.
East Coast, Stephen, remote.
Well, it's definitely more isolated in Tassie. We had a great deaf program at Claremont Primary School, at the Claremont School. We were the leaders at that time in Australia. Unfortunately, the government made decisions that affected that, even though we had a well-renowned program and people lobbied and did all the work. Unfortunately, things were then separated into regions. So we do have deaf children's camps every year, and it's perfect for you. We're planning to have one on the East Coast, so more information will come soon about that. And those camps are a great way for deaf kids and families to meet each other. Whether those families are using Auslan or spoken English, it doesn't matter. The plan for those camps is to include everyone. And we're in discussion with the Department of Education about that. And, we know it's hard to develop a network and do that. So with the NDIS, we often ask people to ask for deaf mentors as well. And if there's no one locally, that can be provided through Skype or something like that. Those things exist in WA, and we're working on improving things in Tasmania. It's definitely more isolated, but we're working on it. We basically want to keep good relationships and open dialogue. We don't want to and things have improved, but it is hard when you're advocating not to just be considered someone who's complaining and then having the door shut on you. So it's an ongoing relationship and it's work that continues. We don't want to be too gung-ho about it.
When is the next Deaf Game, Stephen?
So we have deaf sports and we have deaf games that are there opportunities for deaf people to socialise. The next one's in January 2024 in Newcastle. So that's another opportunity where the deaf community gather, people play sport and compete, but there's also heaps of socialising that happens on the sidelines. It's a really great social opportunity
And you know,
for
my
deaf people.
grandson, he's in Perth, he was actually nominated to go to a deaf youth camp that is based in South America. And he's had to learn ASL and particularly one-handed American Sign Language and one-handed finger spelling. So, you know, we use two-handed finger spelling here, but in America they use one-handed finger spelling. So it's a great experience for him, a wonderful experience. And my daughter, some years ago, went to America as an exchange student for a year. And it was just so beneficial on so many levels. I think, yeah, really worthwhile.
Thank you for the question, and I hope you can find some good connections. Welcome to Tassie. Well, that's probably all we have time for. Thank you. It's so weird and scary to get sat up in front of an audience and ask questions about yourself and your life, and thank you for lending us your expertise tonight. You delightful group of people. Can we please show one more round of applause for the Unheard Of panel tonight?
And back at you all. Thank you very much from Amy.
Oh, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your festival.